The air in Redemption Gulch is a fine, gritty powder that settles on everything and in everything. It coats the unpainted clapboard of the buildings with a uniform dun, fills the lungs with the taste of baked earth, and grinds between the teeth with every nervous chew of a tobacco plug. In the center of this parched tableau, Elias Thorne's cobbler shop sits small and unassuming, a place most folks pass without a second glance. The sign above his door, with its faded, neatly painted boot, is the most articulate thing about him. Elias himself is a man of profound silences, his days measured not in conversation, but in the rhythmic tap of his hammer, the scrape of his awl, and the pull of waxed thread through stubborn leather. He is a loner, not by accident, but by a carefully constructed design that began the day he arrived 2 years ago with nothing but a satchel of tools and a past he never spoke of. The townsfolk, for their part, accept his silence as a feature of the landscape, like the heat or the wind. He is the cobbler. He fixes their boots. It is a simple, necessary transaction that requires no friendship. But today, the transaction is different. A shadow falls across his doorway, timid and sharp-edged in the unforgiving afternoon sun. Elias doesn't look up immediately. He is finishing a stitch on a rancher's worn-out roper, his hands moving with the placid certainty of long practice. He can feel the hesitation in the shadow, the palpable fear that radiates from it like heat off a rock. When he finally lifts his head, his gray eyes take in the visitor in a single, comprehensive glance. She is Apache, not a reservation Apache, who sometimes traded in town under the watchful, wary eye of the sheriff, but one from the free bands in the hills, the ones the town whispered about with a mixture of terror and loathing. Her deerskin dress is dusty from travel, her face a mask of stoic exhaustion. Behind the shield of her skirt, a small child, no older than 4, peeks out, his dark eyes wide with a fear that mirrors his mother's. But it is her feet that draw Elias's professional gaze. One moccasin is whole. The other is a disaster, the sole flapping loose, a testament to a hard journey and a sudden, critical failure. She holds herself impossibly still, as if bracing for the inevitable shout, the slammed door, the rifle leveled in her direction. Her presence here is a desperate gamble, an act of last resort. The silence in the small shop deepens, thick with the smell of leather, wax, and the unspoken history of 100 bloody skirmishes. Elias can feel the town's eyes on his back, peering through his front window. He sees Mrs. Gable from the general store pause her sweeping, her mouth a tight, disapproving line. He sees 2 cattle hands stop mid-stride, their hands hovering near their hips. He is being watched, judged, and in that moment, the woman and the loner cobbler are the 2 most isolated people in Redemption Gulch. He knows what he is supposed to do. He is supposed to yell, to chase her away, to affirm his allegiance to the fragile bubble of civilization he inhabits. But Elias looks from the broken moccasin to the child's dusty, vulnerable face, and the machinery of his quiet life grinds to a halt. He sets down the rancher's boot, wipes his hands on his leather apron, and gives a short, almost imperceptible nod toward the empty stool beside his workbench. It is not a welcome, not quite. It is a simple, non-negotiable instruction. Seat. The woman hesitates for a heartbeat longer, her gaze searching his for any sign of a trap. She finds none, only a profound, unsettling stillness. Slowly, she steps inside, guiding her child with her. The air changes as the door swings partly shut, muffling the sounds of the street and enclosing the 3 of them in a pocket of shared peril. Elias points to her foot. She understands. With practiced grace, she sits and lifts her foot, presenting the ruined moccasin. He doesn't speak. He simply takes it, his calloused fingers assessing the damage with a familiar, diagnostic touch. His life and hers are about to be stitched together by a single, charitable act. There's more to this loner cobbler than meets the eye. Before his true character and its consequences come to light, tell us, have you ever misjudged someone only to be surprised? And if you love a story of hidden depths, hit like and subscribe. The woman watches him, her body coiled with tension. She expects a price to be named, a demand she cannot possibly meet. She reaches into a small pouch at her waist and pulls out a thin, finely beaded bracelet, the pattern of vibrant, complex geometry of blue and white. She holds it out to him, an offering of immense value, perhaps the only thing of worth she has left. Elias glances at the bracelet, then back at her face. He gives his head a single, small shake. He doesn't want her payment. He turns back to the workbench, laying the moccasin on the scarred wooden surface. For him, this isn't about commerce. It is about a broken thing that needs mending and a person in desperate need. The world outside his shop, with its bitter feuds and ingrained hatreds, ceases to exist. There's only the task at hand. And with 3 words, uttered in a voice raspy from disuse, he seals their strange pact. It needs stitching. His life and the fragile piece of Redemption Gulch were irrevocably changed. Elias Thorne had come to Redemption Gulch to forget the sound of his own voice. In another life, a life before the dust and the silence, that voice had been full of laughter, arguments, and soft words meant for a wife and daughter. That life had ended in a muddy street in Ohio, with a runaway wagon and a hesitation on his part that he would forever see as a fatal failure of nerve. He hadn't been fast enough, hadn't been brave enough. He had survived, and they had not. The silence they left behind was a roaring beast. So he had traveled west until he found a place where silence was the norm, a place where a man could disappear inside himself, and no one would bother to come looking. Redemption Gulch was that place. It was a town perched on the edge of territory that still remembered the bite of an Apache arrow. The fear was a living entity, stoked by men like Jedediah Kane. Kane was the town's patriarch, a rancher whose vast holdings were built on land treaties that were more swindle than negotiation. He was a big man with a booming voice and a certainty that his own prosperity was a sign of God's favor. He preached a gospel of vigilance and extermination, painting the Apache not as people defending their home, but as inhuman savages, a monolithic threat to be feared and eradicated. His word was law for many, and his hatred was the town's most reliable currency. When the Apache woman left Elias's shop an hour later, the freshly repaired moccasin secure on her foot, the transaction was not over. It had just begun. He had worked with methodical care, using a strip of his finest oiled leather for the patch and stitching it with thread double wax for strength. He'd even hammered the worn sole to soften it. As he handed it back, he'd pushed a small cup of water toward the child, who drank it down with wide, thirsty eyes. The woman had met Elias's gaze, and in her dark eyes he saw not just gratitude, but a piercing understanding. She knew what he had risked. She gave a slow, deliberate nod, a promise and a warning all in one. And then she was gone, melting back into the landscape as if she were a spirit of the dust itself. The aftermath was immediate. The whispers started before the dust of her departure had even settled. They followed Elias like burrs on a blanket. He heard them from the saloon as he passed, saw it with my own eyes. Just let her walk right in. He felt them in the stiff back of the clerk at the general store, who counted out his change with an air of handling something unclean. Jedediah Kane's wife, a woman whose face seemed permanently pinched in disapproval, crossed the street with a theatrical gasp to avoid walking past his door. By evening, the unofficial nature of the town's judgment became official. Sheriff Miller, a man whose spine was as flexible as a willow branch, appeared in Elias's doorway. Miller was not a bad man, merely a weak one, a man who saw his job as maintaining the peace by placating the most powerful voice in any room. Right now, that voice belonged to Kane. Elias, the sheriff began, shifting his weight from one foot to the other. Folks are talking. Elias continued to sweep the leather scraps from his floor, his movements unhurried. They usually are. This is different. Helping one of them, it's a bad look. Kane has riled up something fierce. Says you're inviting trouble. Says you're putting the whole town at risk. Elias finally stopped sweeping and leaned on his broom. He looked at the sheriff, his gray eyes clear and steady. A woman's shoe was broken. She had a child with her. I'm a cobbler. I fixed it. It ain't that simple, and you know it, Miller grumbled, his gaze falling to the floor. These are dangerous times. You can't be seen to be consorting. Jedediah says if a man ain't with us, he's against us. I'm not against anyone, Sheriff. I'm just trying to mend what's broken. Elias's voice was quiet, but it held a core of something hard and unyielding, something Sheriff Miller hadn't expected. Just be careful, Elias, Miller said, turning to leave. Kane's got a long memory and a short temper. Don't go stirring the pot. The sheriff left, and Elias stood in the encroaching twilight of his shop. The small space, once his sanctuary from the world, now felt like the very center of it. The quiet he had so carefully cultivated had been shattered, not by a loud noise, but by a silent act of decency. He looked at the empty stool where the woman had sat, a faint scuff mark from her good moccasin on the floor. He felt a strange sort of peace settle over him. For the first time since losing his family, he had acted without hesitation. He had not failed. Whatever came next, he would face it. The silence he lived in now was one of his own choosing, a silence of defiance, not of grief. The days that followed were a slow, simmering lesson in ostracism. Business, which had always been steady, dwindled to a trickle. The ranchers who once brought him their work now rode past, their faces averted. The townswomen who needed shoes for their children suddenly found reasons to wait. Elias's world shrank to the four walls of his shop, but he did not waver. He spent his time meticulously cleaning and oiling his tools, sorting his leather by grade and thickness, and reinforcing the shelves that held his supplies. He was preparing, though for what, he wasn't certain. The first direct confrontation came a week after the incident. Jedediah, Kane himself, flanked by two of his bulliest ranch hands, darkened Elias's doorway. Kane was a mountain of a man, his belly straining the buttons of his vest, his face flushed with self-importance and whiskey. "Thorne," he boomed, his voice filling the small shop and rattling the jars of nails on the shelf. "I hear you've gone into business with the Red Man." Elias was buffing a pair of boots he'd repaired months ago, keeping his hands busy. He didn't look up. "Evening, Mr. Kane." "Don't you evening me, you traitorous little whelp," Kane snarled, stepping fully into the shop. His men blocked the doorway, their thumbs hooked in their gun belts. "This is a God-fearing, white town. We don't truck with savages. You brought that filth into this town, into a shop on this very street. You give them aid and comfort. You're no better than they are." Elias placed the boot down carefully. He finally raised his eyes to meet Kane's. "I gave a mother and her child a drink of water and fixed her shoe, Mr. Kane. If that's a crime in your eyes, then I suppose I'm a criminal." The quiet dignity in Elias's response seemed to infuriate Kane more than any argument would have. "You're a fool. You think that little act of kindness means anything to them. They'd as soon lift your scalp as look at you. They see kindness as weakness. You've marked this town, Thorne. When they come for us, they'll know we have a weak link. They'll know we have a sympathizer in our midst. Perhaps they'll know we have a man who understands the difference between a warrior and a mother," Elias said, his voice still low and even. Kane's face purpled. He took a step forward, his shadow engulfing Elias. "You listen to me. You are on thin ice. One more misstep, one more sign that your loyalties ain't with your own kind, and I'll see to it you're run out of this territory on a rail." He turned and stomped out of the shop, his men following like loyal hounds. Elias stood in the silence, his heart hammering against his ribs. The threat was plain. He was a marked man, not by the Apache, but by the so-called civilized folk of Redemption Gulch. That night, sleep offered little respite. He dreamt of his daughter's laughter, a sound that now seemed to belong to another world entirely. He woke before dawn, a familiar ache in his chest. He rose and went to unlatch his front door, to feel the cool morning air. On his doorstep, placed neatly in the center of the worn wooden stoop, was a small object. It was a bird carved from a piece of pale, smooth wood, its wings half spread, as if in mid-flight. The craftsmanship was simple but elegant, each cut precise. Elias picked it up, his thumb tracing the lines of the wings. He knew, with absolute certainty, who had left it. It wasn't payment. It was a message A thank you. A symbol of a connection forged in silence and risk. He closed his hand around the small bird, its wooden form a tangible weight against his palm. He was not as alone as Cain believed. He slipped the carving into his apron pocket, where it rested against his heart, a secret shield. The town's hostility, however, was far from secret. 2 nights later, he was jolted awake by the sharp crash of breaking glass. He rushed to the front of his shop to find his main window shattered, a jagged hole gaping like a wound. A large rock lay on the floor amidst the glittering shards. He stepped outside into the moonlight and saw the words scrawled across his door in crude, white paint, "Traitor." He stood there for a long time, the cool night air raising goosebumps on his arms. This was Cain's work, or the work of those who followed him. It was a public branding, a formal declaration of his exile. He felt a tremor of the old fear, the fear of being singled out, of being helpless. But then his fingers found the wooden bird in his pocket. He thought of the Apache woman's steady gaze, of the child's thirsty eyes. A different feeling rose to meet the fear, a cold, hard resolve. He didn't call for the sheriff. He knew Miller would do nothing, likely blaming Elias for provoking the attack. Instead, he found a piece of canvas and tacked it over the broken window. He spent the rest of the night scrubbing the paint from his door. He would not wear their accusation. By morning, the wood was raw and clean, though the ghost of the word remained, visible only to him. The incident pushed Elias further into his isolation, but it also sharpened his senses. He began to see the town not as a community, but as a collection of factions. There were the zealots, who followed Cain without question. There were the fearful, who went along with Cain because they were too scared to do otherwise. And then there were the silent ones. He caught glimpses of them. The blacksmith who met his eye for a second too long with something that wasn't hostility. The doctor's wife who left a small loaf of bread on his back step. The stable boy who gave him a quick, furtive nod. They were minority, voiceless, and cautious, but they were there. They were the ones who hadn't yet surrendered their conscience to Cain's crusade. The pressure continued to build. Cain, realizing that shaming and petty vandalism hadn't broken Elias, escalated his tactics. He appeared one afternoon with a sheaf of papers and an offer that was nothing more than a thinly veiled threat. "Thorne," he said, bypassing any greeting, "I'm prepared to make you a generous offer. Your business is failing. You have no customers. This town has no use for you. I'll buy you out. Your tools, your stock, this building. $200. More than it's worth, but I'm a charitable man." Elias looked at the man who had orchestrated the campaign against him, now feigning generosity. "And if I refuse?" Cain's benevolent mask slipped. "Then I'll make sure you can't even sell a shoelace in this town. I'll buy the building from a land agent in Tucson and have you evicted. I'll see to it you're charged with vagrancy. There are a dozen ways to get rid of a pest, Thorne. This one is the easiest for you. Take the money and ride out. Disappear. It's your only choice." Elias felt the walls of his small world closing in. Cain had the power, the money, and the influence to do exactly as he threatened. To stay meant ruin. To leave meant Cain would win. It meant the hatred would win. He looked past Cain's shoulder, through the open door to the sun-bleached street. He thought of running, of finding another quiet place to hide. The thought filled him with a familiar, bitter taste of self-loathing. He had run once before, from his grief. He would not run again. His hand went to the wooden bird in his pocket. He drew it out and placed it gently on the workbench between them. It was a tiny, defiant statement. "My answer is no, Mr. Cain," Elias said. His voice was steady. "This is my shop. I'm not leaving." Cain stared at the carved bird, his eyes narrowing as he understood its significance. He saw it not as a gift, but as proof of collusion. "So, that's how it is," he hissed. "You've chosen your side. You'll regret this, Thorne. I promise you that." He spun on his heel and stormed out, leaving the threat hanging in the air like poison gas. Elias was left in the ringing silence. He had drawn a line in the dust. He knew Cain would stop at nothing to erase him from it. He sat at his workbench, the small wooden bird in his palm, and waited for the storm to break. It came not as he expected. It came with the dawn. He was awakened by a sound he had never heard before, a soft, percussive thump, like a heavy bird hitting the roof. Then another, into the wall beside his bed. Thump, and another. Thump, thump. The rhythm grew faster, a terrifying drumbeat on the thin wooden walls of his shop. It wasn't the sound of rocks or fists. It was something else. Something swift, silent, and deadly. He crept from his bed, his heart a frantic bird in his chest. He peered through a crack in the canvas, covering his broken window. The pre-dawn light was gray and thin, casting the world in shades of ash. And he saw them. Arrows. The street was empty, the town still asleep, but his shop was being buried in them. They flew from the low ridge that overlooked the north end of town, silent arcs of death in the twilight. They slammed into his walls, embedding themselves inches deep in the seasoned pine. They peppered his roof, their fletchings quivering in the still air. They struck the fence posts out front, the water barrel, the sign with the faded boot. The assault was relentless, a hailstorm of sharpened steel and wood. Elias pressed himself against the wall, every muscle tensed, waiting for the splintering crash of an arrow coming through the window, through the door, through his own flesh. The air was filled with the steady, sickening thump, thump, thump of their arrival. It felt like an eternity, but it could only have been a few minutes. And then, as suddenly as it began, it stopped. The silence that descended was absolute, heavier and more profound than any that had come before. It was a silence punctuated by the visual scream of dozens, perhaps hundreds, of arrows bristling from every surface of his small building. His shop looked like a wounded porcupine, a grim testament to a terrifying display of force. Slowly, cautiously, Elias moved toward the door. His hand trembled as he reached for the latch. He was certain he was opening the door to his own death, that warriors were waiting for him on the other side. He took a deep breath and pulled it open. And he stared. The world outside was a nightmare of feathered shafts. Arrows stuck out of the wall on either side of the doorway, so close he could touch them by stretching out his arms. They studded the doorframe itself. But not a single arrow had touched the door. Not a single one had violated the threshold. His new canvas window patch, fragile and flimsy, was untouched. A clear, deliberate path, wide enough for a man to walk through, was left completely clear from his door to the middle of the street. It was not an attack. It was a statement, a message written in the language of power for the whole town to read. The Apache had seen the broken window. They had understood the painted word, and this was their response. They had drawn a line of their own, a lethal perimeter around the quiet cobbler and his shop. They had repaid their debt not with a trinket, but with a terrifying declaration of protection. Elias Thorne was theirs to watch over, and any who harmed him would face this storm for Rael. The first person to emerge onto the street was the baker, his face pale with confusion as he saw the state of the cobbler's shop. He stopped dead, his tray of morning rolls forgotten in his hands. Then a window creaked open, then another. A collective gasp rippled through Redemption Gulch. Within minutes, the street was full of people, their sleep-addled minds struggling to process the impossible sight. They stared, mouths agape, at the building that had been turned into an arsenal. Their initial shock quickly curdled into terror. They didn't see the careful, deliberate pattern Elias had seen. They saw an act of aggression, a warning shot before massacre, and they knew who to blame. "It's Thorne," someone shouted, his voice cracking with fear. "The Indian lover. He brought this on us." The cry was taken up by others, a rising murmur of panic and rage. "They've marked their target. He's a spy. He sold us out." Jedediah Kane emerged from his large house at the end of the street, his face a mask of grim, vindicated fury. He had been waiting for this. The arrows were a gift, proof of everything he had been saying. He saw the fear in his neighbor's eyes and knew he could shape it to his will. "See," he roared, his voice cutting through the frightened chatter. "See what his friendship with the savages has brought to our doorstep. This is a declaration of war. They're telling us where they will strike first. We have a traitor in our midst, a cancer that must be cut out before it kills us all." He was a master of his craft, and his craft was fear. He played on their deepest anxieties, turning their terror away from the unseen archers on the ridge and focusing it onto the one man they could see, the one man they could touch. "What do we do, Jedediah?" a woman cried out. "We do what must be done," Cain bellowed, raising a fist. "We defend our homes. We defend our families. We start by cleansing our own house of the filth that invited this plague. We get rid of the traitor, Thorn. Then we show those godless heathens what happens when they threaten the good people of Redemption Gulch." A primal roar went up from the crowd. The fragile veneer of civility dissolved in a wave of collective hysteria. Men ran to their homes for rifles and pistols. Others grabbed pitchforks from barns, axes from woodpiles. A mob, raw and hungry, was born in the morning sun. Sheriff Miller appeared, his face ashen. He tried to speak, to urge caution, but his voice was swallowed by the rage. Cain shoved him aside contemptuously. "Are you with us or with him?" Cain demanded, and the sheriff, looking at the sea of enraged faces, simply shrank back, becoming just another spectator. Inside his shop, Elias heard it all. He heard the accusations, the rising tide of violence, Cain's voice orchestrating it all into a single, murderous purpose. He could have run out the back, tried to lose himself in the scrubland behind the town, but he knew it was pointless. The runner's life was over. He had made his stand when he'd mended the moccasin, and he would not betray it now. He walked to his workbench and sat on his stool, the same stool where the Apache woman had sat. He placed his hands on the scarred wood, his fingers tracing the gouges and nicks of his trade. He was a cobbler, a mender of broken things. He had tried to mend a small piece of a broken world, and now the world was coming to break him. He closed his eyes and listened to the approaching thunder of footsteps and angry shouts, a profound and terrible calm settling over him. He was ready. The mob surged down the street, a beast with 100 feet, Cain at its head. They stopped before the arrow-studded shop, a vortex of fury and fear. The building itself seemed to defy them, its grim decorations a silent rebuke. "Thorn!" Cain bellowed, his voice raw with power. "Come out and face your judgment, or by God, we'll burn this den of yours to the ground with you in it." The mob roared its approval, the sound of physical blow against the thin walls. Elias did not move. He opened his eyes and stared at his door, at the wood that held the ghosts of his tools, his labor, his quiet life. "Break it down," Cain commanded, pointing a meaty finger at the door. Two men with a heavy wooden beam from a nearby construction site moved forward, preparing to ram the entrance. The crowd pressed in, eager for the violence, for the release of their terror. The beam swung back, the men grunting with effort. And then a sudden stillness fell. It began at the back of the crowd, a wave of silence that moved forward as, one by one, people turned their heads. A man in the front, just as the beam was about to swing forward, dropped his end. He stared, his face slack with a new, more potent fear, toward the ridge overlooking the town. On the crest, outlined against the bright morning sky, was a line of riders. They were motionless, like statues carved from the rock in the sky. 10, 20, 30 of them. Apache warriors, mounted on wiry ponies, their faces grim, their rifles held loosely across their laps. They were not preparing to attack. They were simply watching, their presence a weight that crushed the breath from the mob's lungs. The rage that had fueled the townsfolk moments before evaporated, replaced by the cold, primal fear of the truly powerless. From the center of the line of warriors, one figure detached himself and began to ride slowly down the slope. He was a man of formidable bearing, his face a mask of chiseled granite, his eyes holding the wisdom of the unforgiving land. As he drew closer, Elias, peering through the crack in his canvas window, saw the intricate beadwork on the man's vest and recognized the pattern from the bracelet the woman had offered him. This was her husband, the child's father. He did not ride toward the mob. He rode directly to Elias's shop, guiding his pony through the clear path left by the arrows. He dismounted with fluid grace, the jingle of his harness the only sound in the unnaturally silent street. He stood before the door, ignoring the terrified crowd completely. He looked at the shop, bristling with the shafts he and his men had fired. He ran a hand over the fletching of an arrow lodged beside the doorframe. Then he turned his gaze on Jedediah Kane. He did not speak. He simply looked, and in that look was all the contempt a mountain for a puff of dust. He pointed one finger at the arrows studding the building, then swept his hand to indicate the untouched door, the clear path, the unharmed window. The message was as clear as if it had been shouted. This was not for you. This was for him. Kane, who had been the engine of the mob's fury, seemed to shrink. The bluster and rage drained out of him, leaving a hollow shell of a man, his face pasty with terror. The rifle in his hands suddenly seemed heavy and useless. The Apache leader's gaze shifted, meeting Elias's through the crack in the canvas. Then he spoke, his voice low and guttural, but carrying with perfect clarity in the dead silence. He spoke a few words in his own tongue, then switched to the halting, hard-won English of the trading posts. "This one," he said, gesturing with his chin toward the shop. "He is Daeowahi, the mender of paths." He paused, letting the name settle. "His path is protected. You touch his path, you walk on snakes." He held up his hand, and for the first time, everyone saw it. Tied around his wrist was the blue and white beaded bracelet. The payment Elias had refused. It was not a bribe. It was a bond. The Apache leader held Kane's terrified gaze for a moment longer, a silent promise of what would happen if his warning was not heeded. Then, without another word, he swung himself back onto his pony. He gave one final, solemn nod toward Elias's door, a nod between equals, a nod of profound and fierce respect. Then he turned his horse and rode back up the slope to rejoin his silent watchers. The mob was no longer a mob. It was just a collection of frightened, shamed individuals. They looked from the retreating warrior to Kane, who stood exposed and impotent, his authority shattered. Then they looked at the cobbler's shop, no longer seeing a traitor's den, but a fortress defended by a power they could not comprehend or challenge. Silently, they began to melt away. They shuffled back to their homes, their rifles and pitchforks now looking foolish in their hands. They couldn't meet each other's eyes. They certainly couldn't meet the accusing silence of the arrow-pierced building. Soon, only Kane was left, alone in the street, the sun beating down on his humiliation. He gave the shop one last look of pure, undiluted hatred, then turned and scurried back to the empty refuge of his house. The line of warriors on the ridge watched for a moment longer, ensuring their message was understood. Then, as one, they turned and vanished back into the vast, indifferent landscape from which they had come. The silence that returned to Redemption Gulch was absolute. Elias Thorne slowly pushed his door fully open and stepped out into the sunlight. He stood on his porch, surrounded by the physical evidence of the day's terror and salvation. The air still smelled of fear and ozone, but underneath it, for the first time since he had arrived, he could smell the faint, clean scent of sagebrush on the wind. He was still a loner, but he was no longer in exile. He was protected. He was home. In the quiet aftermath, the arrows remained. Elias made no move to pull them out. They became a part of the shop, a strange and permanent fixture of the town's architecture and its memory. The people of Redemption Gulch learned to live with them. They would walk past, their eyes tracing the lines of the feathered shafts, and they would remember. They would remember their own fear, their own fury, and their own shame. And they would remember the quiet cobbler who had faced them all down without raising his voice or his hand. Jedediah Kane's power was broken. A man who rules by fear cannot survive being seen as fearful himself. His booming voice became a resentful mutter, his pronouncements ignored. The town, no longer under his spell, began to find its own, quieter equilibrium. A few days after the confrontation, Elias was at his workbench, methodically restitching a seam on an old saddlebag, when a shadow fell across his doorway. It was the blacksmith, a large, quiet man named Olson who had been in the mob, swept along by the current. He stood at the threshold, holding a pair of his son's badly scuffed boots. He didn't speak of the arrows, or of Kane, or of the warriors on the ridge. He simply cleared his throat. "Boys gone through the toes again," Olson said, his voice gruff with unspoken apology. He held out the boots. Elias took them, turning them over in his hands. "I can patch them," he said. "Be ready by tomorrow." Olson nodded, his gaze lingering for a second on an arrow buried deep in the wall, just inches from Elias's head. He looked back at Elias, and in his eyes was a new and profound respect. He laid a few coins on the counter, more than the repair was worth, and left without another word. It was the beginning. Slowly, cautiously, the town came back to him. A boot that needed a heel, a strap that needed mending, a leather pouch with a broken drawstring. Each transaction was quiet, freighted with the weight of all that had happened. They were not just paying for repairs anymore. They were paying tribute, in their own small way, to the man who had shown them a different kind of strength. Elias worked, his hands moving with their old, familiar grace. He was still a man of few words, his shop still a haven of silence. But the silence had changed. It was no longer the silence of loneliness or grief. It was the silence of peace, the silence of a man who had found his place not by fitting in, but by standing firm. That evening, as the sun set and painted the sky in hues of orange and deep purple, Elias stood in his doorway. He ran a hand over the rough, splintered wood around the shaft of an arrow near the frame. It was a permanent scar, a reminder of the day the world had tried to break him and failed. He looked out at the quiet street, at the distant hills where his unlikely guardians lived, and a small, slow smile touched his lips. He was the mender of paths, and he knew, with a certainty that settled deep in his bones, that his own path, once so lost and broken, was finally whole. He made a compassionate choice that changed lives. Do you think more people should act on such instincts? Share your thoughts. Thanks for watching. If you believe in compassion, overcoming prejudice, and finding love in unexpected places, give this story a like and subscribe for more. What part of this Western saga resonated with you the most? We'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments.